Hello, everybody, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for the launch of this new resource with Dr. Alessia Tranchese called Reporting on Rape, Changing the Narrative. My name is Andrea Simon. I'm the director of the End Violence Against Women Coalition. And just to say a little bit about us and why working with the media is so important to us, we're a coalition of 163 frontline services, activists, survivors, researchers, and NGOs working to end all forms of men's violence against women and girls. And we were set up by our members in 2005 to improve responses to abuse and campaign for changes that would transform the political and social systems that enable violence against women. So we drive social change through campaigning and shaping policy, but also by challenging the wider cultural attitudes that tolerate and normalise this abuse. And this includes working with the media to shape reporting on violence against women and girls. So working with the media is often very central to how we try and achieve change in our campaigning, both at the political level by informing and holding the government to account, but also at a societal level by informing the public or amplifying the experiences and stories of survivors and challenging the cultural attitudes and beliefs that mean violence against women is often tolerated or disregarded as a normal part of life. Journalists and media institutions can be really powerful players in helping to tackle and prevent this abuse, and we're really grateful for all the fantastic work that goes on, brings this abuse and the inequality that lies behind it to light. Many journalists engaged in telling these stories are here with us today. And in Violence Against Women Coalition, we firmly believe that men's violence towards women is not an inevitable part of life and that a different world is possible and achievable. But in order to do this, we have to work at unpicking some of those root causes that actually drive and justify this violence. On that, we still have so much more work to do. Rape and sexual assault continues at an alarming scale. More than 1 in 4 women report being raped or sexually assaulted as an adult, but only around 5 in 100 recorded rapes result in charges being brought, and that's let alone a conviction. Recent headlines on rape have shown just how prevalent rape myths and stereotypes are, with courageous survivors described as seeking revenge instead of seeking justice. Perpetrators offered sympathy and a justification for their actions, and some of the language used really showing up exactly how our justice system and society as a whole can so often be stacked against survivors. I think this contributes to a cultural context in which most victims don't report rape to the police, and some don't even recognise that what happened to them is rape and therefore don't access the support that they need to recover. But we know that it doesn't have to be this way, and that by changing the way we talk and think about rape, we can see justice for more victims and we can work towards preventing it from happening in the first place. Now, journalists, editors, and everyone working in the media can play a crucial role in this, and it's our hope that the resource that we're launching today will be a source of reflection and a guide that can be returned to when reporting on rape and sexual violence. We have a fantastic expert panel today who will be discussing all of this and more. On our panel, we have Observer journalist, writer and broadcaster Yvonne Roberts, the senior news reporter at The Guardian, Alexandra Topping, a journalist at The Mirror and editor of the Thread newsletter, Melissa Segodo, and academic Dr. Alessia Tranchese, who's a senior lecturer in communication and applied linguistics at the University of Portsmouth. She's also the author of a book analysing 12 years of reporting on rape and the resource for journalists that we're launching today. If you have questions for our fantastic panel, please do use the Q&A function on this webinar to submit them, and we will either answer them online or I'll try and pose as many questions as we can to the panel later. I'm now going to hand over to Alessia, who's going to present her excellent research and explore some of the findings in more detail.
Hi, Andrea, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my slides now. Okay, can I just check that you can see my presentation? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much again, Andrea, for the introduction, and Ivo for organizing this event. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on my research and the book that Andrea has just mentioned. So, as you all know, in 2017, the hashtag #MeToo went viral online, and it was hailed as a watershed moment for women's rights. So the question I wanted to ask is, has anything changed in terms of progressing towards a less stereotypical representation of sexual violence, as this has historically been a problem for women's rights and for women's equality? So this resource is based on my research published in my book From Fritzl to Me Too, 12 Years of Rape Coverage in the British Press, which covers 12 years of rape coverage in the most popular British newspapers, and including the pre and post Me Too period. And it covered a data set of about 90 million words. So it's a very large data set of articles written about rape, sexual assault, and sexual abuse. Very briefly, to summarize the findings, what I found is that rape myths remain deeply embedded in media representations, but adapt to changing societal standards. Just to give you a definition of rape myths, these are considered beliefs that present simplistic assumptions about rape, rapists, and rape victims as commonplace and truthful. So, for example, the myth that it's not really rape unless it's by a stranger, while in reality, most rapists are known to the victim. So one of the problems with rape myths is that no matter how problematic they are, they do represent the foundation of most dominant rape narratives that we hear in society, including in the media. Another problem with rape myths is that they're not often expressed in such blatant terms like the one that I have just shown you, but can be more subtly embedded in discourse, especially in supposedly progressive societies. And what I mean by progressive is societies that believe they have progressed towards a so-called post-feminist world where women have achieved equality, while in reality, these myths have become more deeply hidden. So as rape myths evolve and adapt to this new environment, they become harder to dismantle. And so this is what I wanted to do in my study, look at these more hidden myths. What I found is that there are 3 rape myths that persist. It's first of all, the myth of real rape, then the myth that women lie about being raped, and the myth of credible victims and perpetrators. So in terms of the first myth of real rape, this is the myth that credible rape only happens when it is perpetrated by a violent stranger, which, as I explained earlier, is not true. The way this myth manifested itself in my data set was with the word rape strongly and frequently being associated with words that indicate crimes that involve death and additional physical violence, such as murder, killing, torture, mutilation, and stabbing. Interestingly, this pattern was less visible with terms like sexual assault or sexual abuse. So it's something that is specific to the use of the word rape, whose constant and reoccurring frequent co-occurrence with these other words like murder or killing means that rape has absorbed that meaning in itself. The consequence of this is that the meaning of rape in my data set, at least, has shrunk, and it has become a very narrow meaning, which evokes a mental image of visible physical violence, which, and this is the crucial point, does not match its legal or social reality. The second myth is the myth that women lie about being raped. The truth is that the vast majority of rape reports are true, and only 0.6% of allegations are supposedly false. However, what I found in my study is that there is an inconsistency, and there are double standards in the ways that women's words and men's words are presented in the news about rape. So women's words are often talked about as allegations rather than reports, which implies that these need to be substantiated by facts. On the other hand, men's words, especially when we have white men and celebrities accused of rape, are presented as denials. They need no justification. In addition to this, these denials are often reinforced with words like vehemently, strongly, vigorously, categorically, strenuously. These words are not just used by, in reality, in fact, they are not often used by perpetrators themselves. For example, they wouldn't say, I vigorously deny, or by their lawyers. They're often used by journalists themselves or by the news themselves to qualify these denials. So these qualifiers imply outrage or indignation. And so strengthened these denials rather than, for example, implying skepticism and so challenging these denials. So I've put here an example from one of the many articles that I have analyzed. And just to give you an idea of what I mean. So this is from a real article that I have read. Ronaldo vigorously denies anything non-consensual occurred, which is a sort of non-committal statement. The other two statements are not to be found in the data set, but it's just something that I have written to create a different narrative. So either Ronaldo alleges or claims he did not rape her, or Ronaldo dismissively denies the victim's account. So here, simply by changing the way in which the denials are qualified, we can create a different narrative. However, the phrases like these or like allegedly he did not rape her were not commonly used in my data set. Now, the thing is, alleged became a commonly used word to qualify women's words and rape and victim, but alleged was not always used very frequently in my data set. What I noticed is there was a spike after 2012 where the connection between alleged and rape and alleged and victim became stronger. And at the same time, I also noticed that in the media, there was a stronger focus on cases of rape perpetrated by celebrities. Now, it's impossible to establish a causational link, so to say that this inevitably led to that. But there is a correlation between these two factors. And I believe this is for two reasons. The first reason why I believe that alleged became more strongly associated with rape and victim over time is that these men are the ones who are most likely to have the financial means to sue newspapers for defamation. And so it is possible the newspapers will be more careful in the way they report these stories. But I also think, and this goes back to the point I was making at the start about being in a more progressive society, I think then today overt victim blaming is more likely to be challenged, which is a good thing. But it also means that we have found some subtler ways to still to keep these myths alive. And with alleged, this is particularly true because it is a word that does not overtly blame the victim. It is presented as a legal requirement. It is a legal requirement, but it looks like a form of fairness towards the perpetrator, while in reality, it shows the inconsistencies and double standards in the ways men's and women's words are represented. The third myth that I found still persists in the news about rape is the myth of credible victims and perpetrators. And I need to specify that what I mean here is that they are presented as credible or not credible or untrustworthy perpetrators and victims, but these are myths rather than truths. So here we have almost like a mirror situation where when there is a credible perpetrator, there is an untrustworthy victim. So the news reports about rape that I have analyzed seem to emphasize very much the idea that rape is a crime where there's a 50-50 possibility of truth or lie. And the women who are victims of credible perpetrators, so for example, of celebrities, are often scrutinized for their behavior with descriptions such as flirting or teasing. And these women are also more likely to be described as alleged victims. So even if alleged is a legal requirement when there's a trial and there hasn't been a conviction, then I did not find in my study that alleged is used consistently, but it depends very much on who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. And on the other hand, the actions of high-profile men are often downplayed as wrongdoing or misconduct, and the focus is on their successful careers. In terms of what people who are presented as untrustworthy victims or perpetrators, these are often men or women who come from Black or minoritized communities. So in the case of women who are raped and murdered in these communities receive less media attention than white women, despite statistically being more likely to be victims. When it comes to men, they are wrongly categorized as ideal perpetrators. For example, in groups, they are often called gangs, while equivalent forms of organized sexual abuse committed by white men is often referred to as a network. We can think about the Epstein case, for example, where I don't think they were ever referred to as a gang. So why is this important? Why does why all of this matter? So it matters for a number of reasons. Rape myths in the mainstream media are troubling because, like Andrea was saying earlier, they shape and reflect public opinion and discourses about rape. And because they reflect this, they're also a good barometer to understand where we are as a society, our values as a society. Rape myths can also affect policymaking and the running of the legal system itself. And again, like Andrea was saying earlier, they can affect victims' understanding of what happened to them. If a victim believes a rape is a crime that causes death or only causes death or severe bodily harm, she might not see what happened to her as something as rape, and meaning that then she might not access the support and justice that she is entitled to. So how can this resource help? The aim of this resource is to help you recognize, so media practitioners recognize some of the most common rape myths in the media, and also guide you in reporting on rapes responsibly. The aim is to encourage a reflection on the language we use to talk about sexual violence and the ideology behind it. But it is not meant to be a prescriptive tool. We have included a section called Shifting the Language in this resource. It's a section where you will find an accessible list of alternatives to standardized linguistic formulas, which are often used because it's normal to do that when somebody is writing under time pressure. But these formulas are problematic. However, despite having included this section, we also want to make sure that this resource is not seen as a blunt, prescriptive guide to how to use language. For example, in one of the tips we have suggested is about being conscious of the problems with using the passive voice, as it is true that the passive voice is often used in problematic ways, and it is an issue in reporting sexual violence. However, the passive voice is not always a negative choice, linguistic choice. So in this example here, 1 in 20 women are raped or subjected to serious sexual assaults by the time they're 60. It would be actually counterproductive to use the active voice, because here the focus of the sentence is what happens to women. And so we want women to be the subject of this sentence. So to use the active voice here would actually be counterproductive. In the other example, young woman raped in toilets of city center, here the sentence could be changed to the active voice by placing the perpetrator at the forefront. And obviously, if the perpetrator is known, that makes sense. But it depends on the context. If the perpetrator is not known, then it is very difficult to change this into a meaningful sentence. So what we're saying is not to never use the passive voice or to always use the passive voice, but it is to be conscious of the implications of using the passive voice. Another thing that we wanted to highlight about this resource is that we are aware of variation in conflict over certain expressions. And we also accept that there is no single set of rules which will work for every language user in each and every situation and context. So, for example, we have suggested that gender-neutral language should be avoided when talking about male violence against women, because it erases the fact that this is a problem of male violence against women. However, we know that this is a matter of ideology, and language choice is a matter of ideology, even if it's the law that is dictating that. The other point that we wanted to make is that we have tried to take into account practical difficulties and power structures that affect journalists. And obviously, this is something I would be happy to discuss later with the panel and the questions. So things like balancing the demands of a 24-hour news cycle, but also the fact that journalists work within a system like a legal, judicial, and social system that is biased against victims. So what we're trying to say is that there isn't really an easy fix, and we're not trying to say that by changing the language of the media, we can fix the problem. For example, there are decisions. We know that the decisions to whether to use the word alleged or not, or the word wrongdoing to refer to rape, are influenced by legal requirements. We have had a lot of discussions about these words, which is indicative of a problem. So what we are saying, though, is that it is important to discuss why these linguistic choices are insidious, and the media can still be a site of discussion and disruption of these issues. The other thing we wanted to keep in mind is that we know that the news often use police or court reports to in their reports about rape cases, but these sources often mobilize rape myths in their own narratives. So what we're saying is not change their words or not use those sources, but reflect on and choose how to frame these words, these sources in news reports. So this takes me to the last point, which is the aim of the resource is not to simply suggest a list of do's and don'ts. It's not just about changing a few surface language elements, but it is about challenging the cultural narratives behind those choices. So we have listed a number of principles, which I'm going to show in a moment, which can be used as a guide when writing about rape cases. For example, to recognize and choose not to reproduce those very rape myths and bias that are repeated and reinforced by your sources. So the first principle is that rape is rooted in male power over women, and it is not the result of miscommunication. The vast majority of reported rapes are true, and rape is not a crime where the odds of truth or lie are a 50-50 split, even if there is disproportionate emphasis on these cases in the news in some cases. The consent framework sets women up for failure in a crime that often has no witnesses. So the focus on consent obscures power dynamics, especially in cases of long-term domestic abuse, where the point is not really to establish whether she consented or not. And then treating victims and perpetrators in the same way is not fairness, but it is bias against victims because it erases real-world power differentials. So on the basis of these principles, I have thought about some narratives that can replace narratives which are founded on rape myths. I will be happy to discuss this later in the Q&A and to see if you have other ideas, suggestions, what you think about this. Alternative narratives can be, for example, the narrative that the consent framework is insufficient to determine sexual violence, or about the narrative of the pornification of society that normalizes sexual violence. The narrative that women are routinely disbelieved and their words are routinely dismissed, or the narrative that structural inequality fuels male violence against women. So I just want to conclude by saying that changing the way you write about rape might not change the whole narrative, but it will disrupt the dominant narrative. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Alessia, for presenting your really fascinating research. I'm going to bring in the rest of our panel members now, Melissa, Yvonne, and Lexi. And I'm going to pose some questions to you and get your feedback. But just before I do that, because we've had a question come in, Alessia, about the methodology of the research, I wondered if you could just say a few words about how you came to select the articles that featured in your research.
Yes, sure. I'm going to try not to bore you with the details of methodological choices. So the framework that I use, it's called corpus linguistics. In short, is the idea that we can study language patterns by looking at large amounts of text that are processed using computers. Something that wouldn't be possible we couldn't do it manually. So my approach to the study was to not go in this analysis with some preconceived ideas as much as possible, although obviously I was coming at it from a feminist perspective, but to try and let the data speak to me rather than impose some hypothesis onto my data. So what I did is I collected all the articles published between 2012 and 2019 that contained either together or just separately, the expressions rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. And so I collected this data, like I said, it amounts to about 90 million words. And then I separated this data set, because obviously it's so big to manage, into different groups so that I could compare, for example, whether there were differences in the way the media talk about sexual violence when they call it rape or when they call it sexual assault. And this is how I came to the findings about rape being used differently from sexual assault, with a strong association with murder. Murder is the word that consistently over 12 years occurred most frequently with rape. Every year it was rape and murder. So, and all the other words as well. So I hope I have explained it clearly, but I'm happy to give more details.
Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for telling us how you did that. So the first question I'm just going to pose to the panel is, what do we think that good reporting on rape and sexual violence looks like? I don't know if you want to add anything because you did put some examples in your presentation, Alessia. Do you want to add anything, and then I'll bring the others in?
Yes, I'm going to try not to speak too long, because I've already talked for a while. So I would say there are two key things. Obviously, there are a lot of aspects that can be changed about reporting. But if I were to summarize them in two main points, the first point is good reporting for me is reporting that does not rely on conventional narrative formulas, which are prevalent and normalized in stories about rape, but are rooted in rape myths. So good reporting is reporting that thinks outside the box in a way. The things, how can I tell the story with a different narrative? For example, if the chosen narrative of an article is actors' careers destroyed by rape report, then even if I use the word report, using the word report instead of allegations, for example, it's a first step, because allegation does come with the association of mistrust and something that has to be proven. But it doesn't do very much, doesn't go very far in terms of changing, fundamentally challenging the narrative or addressing the deeper issues embedded in that particular storyline. Another example that I have come across of good practice is, which I have seen over the past few years, is including information about helplines and support for survivors, which is very important because it helps survivors recognize what happened to them in sexual violence. However, if this information is attached to a narrative such as he snapped and killed her, then this this undermines the value of adding this information, and so it oversimplifies and distorts reality. The other point that I would say, and I'm happy to talk about this later, I'm going to just briefly mention it. The second aspect, which I think is key to good reporting, is to be critical about your sources. Good reporting is an article that is very critical in assessing the sources that it is using. And obviously, sources are connected to narratives, but it is a particularly tricky point. It's about being also aware of the way we frame those quotes. For example, using say instead of claim or instead of allege. These are all words that have different meanings, and they tend to be associated with different people. So being aware of that, I think it's really important. So yeah, I think there's one big takeaway from what I'm trying to say is that the surface language change is very important, but it's not where it stops. We also need to think about challenging those narratives.
Thank you. Is there would anyone else like to come in on this? Can I come to Lexi actually? Do you have any thoughts about good reporting, what that looks
like? Thanks so much for that, Alessia. It's really eye-opening and really thought-provoking. Even as someone who's reported on this for a long time, it really does make you stop and think and look at how important the words are that we use and how things are framed. For me, I think good reporting on rape puts the focus of the story on the victim. I would say that's very difficult to do sometimes when the victim is practically unknown and we don't know anything about that victim, and we have to be very careful about what we can reveal about that victim. And on the other side of that, you might have a celebrity about whom there is a lot of information. So I guess it's a balance of trying to make sure that you tell the victim story at the same time of meeting the demands of a news story, which would include putting details in about a perpetrator, particularly if they had celebrity. But that kind of leads me to my second point, which is, as reporters, are we looking at the stories that are like the ordinary stories? And that can be, again, hard to get past a news desk because news cycles are busy and the bar is high. But, a way that I found of doing this in the past is to look at structural failings, because we, particularly around the criminal justice system, because that is something that you can go to your editor and say, the police are failing, that's a story, and here is the evidence that supports it, and use the stories of people who have been failed by the system to really show what being in that system is like, and also what their story of rape or sexual assault is. I've interviewed lots of women who, like you said, didn't even realize that it took them a while to say to themselves that they'd been raped. So I think finding ways to tell those ordinary stories is really important.
And I think actually locating some of those stories within the wider system, so what it is that is going on that enables perpetrators or protects perpetrators as well, so locating some of that power dynamic as well. Melissa, do you have any thoughts about good reporting, what that might look like?
I think that good reporting is obviously being sensitive to the victim, and that the story is written sensitively, because obviously this person has gone through a pretty traumatic experience, and they're going to read those words in black and white along with everybody else. So just bearing in mind that it's not just about the story, it's also about the victim, and you want to avoid re-traumatizing them. So I think it's also key to center the story around the victim and let them speak. So personally, I would, as a reporter, I would include a lot of quotes from the victim, so that they can sort of tell the story themselves rather than me trying to take on the role of telling it for them. And that's the beauty of writing a story, is you can include a lot of quotes from the victim. So I think those are the two ways of being sensitive and reporting well. One thing I would like to say as well is that I think just before you even get to the stage of writing the story, I think it's important that these stories are reported on in the first place, because what tends to happen is they don't even get to, the point where you're even writing them down, because maybe people are questioning whether they should write the story. Maybe they can't, they think they won't get it past their editor. And I think even when some of these stories do make the paper or online, sometimes they actually miss out that the person was raped. So you might know the story about Sabina Nessa, a girl who was killed in Kidbrooke in London, but there aren't many stories that tell the fact that she was also raped. And even Zara Alina, who was killed, I think it was in East London, you don't often hear that she was also raped as well. So I think it's important to make sure that that as journalists, we actually tell the full story. And that's also a good way to report well on this issue.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Ivana, do you have any remarks on this one?
I agree with everything that's been said, and Alessia's presentation was very clear. I think one thing that needs to be said is that journalism is a messy business. So you might write the words, but that's not where it stops. A sub-editor will come in, and just even a subtle change of words, I mean, just changing alleged to reported to alleged back again, in other words, reversing a process that you're trying to ensure, can happen, when the subs have got their hands on the copy. The headline is really important. You'd sometimes have really good stories, but the headline is completely the opposite to what the story is trying to convey. And it also depends very much on what you're reporting on. If you're doing a rape trial, what you can say and what you can't say is very confined. If you're doing an investigation, I think Lexi's point about finding a wider context is very important, because that does drive home a reason for doing it, a structural reason for doing it. And I think one of the biggest stories that's constantly missed is the situation we're in with rape. I mean, thankfully, we've now got the revelations around Giselle Pellico and El Fayed. But El Fayed, I mean, this has been known for years and years and years, and there were so many bystanders involved in both those cases. Good journalists, including myself, we should have picked up on that. But then, as Alessia was saying, the lawyers might come in and say, well, there's always a request for yet more proof, yet more proof, yet more proof. So all I was trying to say really was that if journalism was as clean cut and as easy to manage as we'd all like, we might have progressed a bit more. But in terms of the rape, when I was looking at the rape statistics again, I think last year 68,000 rapes were reported to the police. That's 1/6 of the rapes that took place. Of those, only 1 in 5 will actually lead to a charge. Of those, only 2.9% will lead to a conviction. I mean, that's horrendous. And even of those cases that the CPS decides not to prosecute, 1 in 5, when the person who's been attacked wants a right to review, is successful. So we have, I mean, that's the biggest story of all. We have a system that is clearly not working. And when it would be interesting post Fayed and post Pellico to see when all of that is gone, what actually have we got left? Have we still got these structural inadequacies? Because that's just not acceptable.
Yeah. And it feels like we do sort of seem to lurch from one really horrific story that captures everybody's attention till the next horrific story, and all of the women who don't report to the police but who suffer sexual violence, domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls. It's their realities that aren't really hitting the headlines, and that constant victimization of women that doesn't really doesn't really get the attention.
If they could stop calling men who are being prosecuted for rape monsters. They're not monsters. We've seen this now. They're not monsters. They're everyday men.
Certainly,
yeah.
you saw that. You saw lots of men in that community, everyday men with everyday jobs, all having gone onto that site and, you know, followed through with raping an unconscious woman. So yes, are they all monsters, or do they live normal lives, and are they there in plain sight?
One 22-year-old said he didn't know what consent meant. He had no idea what consent was. So you think, you know, you have to keep reinventing the wheel and going back to what actually is consent.
Yeah, we might get back onto that issue actually, but just to move it to the next sort of question about those barriers. We've already started to talk about barriers actually to good reporting. Is it the news cycle pace? Is it the, you know, some of those tricky legal issues that we've been talking about, the language, but is it also sort of lack of knowledge or training as well around this? Can I bring Lexi in first to say what you think some of the barriers are?
I would say, I mean, there's plenty of barriers, but I would say the biggest barrier of all is the law. That we have ridiculously constrictive defamation law in this country. And as journalists, the only defense we have, the only defense is truth. Now, if you've got, you know, only 3% of cases going forward to an actual trial, and, you know, 60-odd% of them getting conviction, then we know the problems with truth when it comes to rape. There's no CCTV footage, you know, it's difficult for it to be cut and dried. So I would say that, you know, in defense of the industry, there's good reasons for using alleged. Sometimes I completely agree with Alessia that if it's often used unthinkingly, and when, you know, we say alleged victim, we could just say woman, but there's good reason that alleged goes in there, and it is because the defamation laws in this country are extremely restrictive, and people are increasingly, in a post-Me Too era, taking newspapers to court, using kind of slap techniques to silence stories before they come out, targeting victims so that they feel that they're terrified to tell their stories, whether they're anonymous or not. So, you know, we have to work under those constraints. So I think it's important that people, like particularly people who may be working campaigning, who don't deal with media lawyers all the time, to understand that, because often the journalist that you might be critical of has really fought for that story to get there. You know, you might see an article and it talks about sexual misconduct, and that feels really depressing, because you're like, it's not sexual misconduct, it's rape, call it what it is. But actually, that journalist might have fought with a lawyer for 6 hours to get that story published, and what they landed on was sexual misconduct, and that's what they were happy with. So I think, you know, it's really useful for all of us to recognize the constraints in which we're working. And obviously there's lots of other stuff, like newsrooms are still very male, they're still very white, and they are still propelled by scandal, and that is what, you know, makes a news story. So it's, you know, as journalists who care about reporting this accurately and properly and being part of a positive discussion, you know, we have to come up with new ways and inventive ways of getting around those barriers.
Thank you. And one of the questions that we received, I'm going to bring it in because it's just related to what's being said just now by Lexi, is that while campaigners and charities emphasise the importance of believing women, the legal system and the media upholds the principle of innocent until proven guilty, not least through libel and contempt laws. How do you see these two principles interacting or conflicting? Can they coexist, and how can journalists navigate both? I wonder what you think, Alessia, about sort of those issues and whether they are in conflict constantly.
Sorry, Andrea, but I think my audio was breaking a little bit. I'm not 100% sure it was just me, but would you mind just repeating it for me, just so I'm sure?
Absolutely. As Lexi's been pointing out, all of the constraints and some of the barriers around the legal system and the words that we can and can't use. Somebody in the audience posted a question saying that campaigners and charities emphasise the importance of believing women, but the legal system and the media upholds the principles of innocence until proven guilty, and not least through libel and contempt laws. How do you see these two principles interacting or conflicting, and can they coexist, and how can journalists manage this? I wonder what you think about that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I got it. In the meantime, I had the train going past, so I think I got the question. I think this question really goes to the heart of what I think is a problem, and goes back to what Lexi was saying. On the one hand, we have this emphasis on believing women. On the other hand, we have the legal emphasis on being fair, which I don't think works, because, like I said in my presentation, the violence against women is not a crime where there is a 50-50 split of the possibility of lie or rape. So I completely agree with Lexi, what she was saying about the legal system and all the barriers that exist. And this is why I don't think the problem is just in the media, it's in the wider system itself. And so the question is, what should we do about changing that, practically speaking, about defamation laws when it comes to rape cases? How can we integrate the idea of believing women within defamation cases? The fact that only 0.6% of rape cases are supposedly false allegations. So basically this means that there's a very high chance that if there is a rape report, that is going to be true. So how can we integrate this in a wider system that doesn't involve just the media, but also the legal system? Because like the person who asked the question was suggesting, I don't think it is possible to square the idea that there was like yeah, I don't think we can square the idea that on the one hand we believe women, but on the other hand we have to give perpetrators the assumption of innocence, but at the same time that does not mean we are assuming that she's lying. I don't know how we square that. I guess we could say, well, we're just assuming that neither of them is lying, but media reporting is very much based on that kind of like his words against her words narrative. So personally, I don't think this can be squared, and I think there needs to be a change in the laws, defamation laws, and that's my view, because I completely agree with Lexi and with Yvonne, but we're just saying there are good reasons why journalists use alleged, and there are good reasons for those journalists, but they are actually not good reasons. They are reasons of the law, which it's itself an ideological position. We know, the law has not been friends of women for, think about rape laws from like 30 years ago. So I don't think that can be squared.
I really appreciated the way that you highlighted the double standards, though, around how reporting of men's accounts and women's accounts often appear, and the additional words that can be added into that to really emphasise men's denials, those descriptors of vehemently, categorically denying, and the outrage that all of that implies, which you don't really see applied to women, and the way that we talk about them. So I do think there are ways that we can think more carefully about language, even in this context. But just to bring Melissa and Yvonne in, Melissa, did you have any specific barriers that came to mind when you think about doing good reporting that you wanted to share?
I think that rape myths are part of one of the barriers that exist when it comes to reporting, because I found in situations where maybe you want to report on a sex worker who's been raped, immediately all the myths about who this person is and if they're credible and if they could be telling the truth, you know, it makes it 10 times harder because there is that stereotype about sex workers and about, you know, what they do for a living and how that is then viewed through, you know, them being raped. So I think that that is a big barrier, this myth about women not being believed. And also, you know, I think at the moment, is it 2% of newsrooms are people of color? And so when you do try, I think there's a difference between reporting on white women who are raped versus women of color who are raped. And that's just another layer that you can add to it. So when you bring in the story of a person of color who's being raped, I think that oftentimes you do see the erasure of their rape, essentially. Like I mentioned before with Zara Alina and Sabina Nessa, they were both raped, but you don't often hear about that. Whereas with Sarah Everard, you do hear that she was raped and murdered. So I think that the fact that newsrooms aren't very diverse, it does mean then that the stories of rape when it comes to women of color do sort of get dismissed and minimized. So I think that that is definitely a barrier. And also, of course, that there aren't as many women at the top within the industry. So that means that, you know, women's stories perhaps aren't being given the treatment that they deserve and aren't being pushed to the fore. So yeah, I think those are some of the barriers that exist when it comes to trying to report on these stories. I hope you can hear me okay.
You can, yes,
okay.
definitely. I think
can I just very quickly add there that Melissa's so right that the structure of a newsroom makes all of the difference in the world. But I think as individual journalists, you can make a small difference just by flagging these things and flagging them to the people at the top. Obviously, some voices are going to be more easily heard than others, but there are ways and means of doing that, and even just, you know, calling out the picture desk because they of the picture that they used, or just, you know, flagging it in a polite way rather than just being annoyed about it and letting it go. And just on those structure point, it obviously really makes a difference. Like we've got obviously our editor is Kath Viner, and one of the big things that we're doing this year is doing a simple news report for every woman that's killed by a man across the year. It's a project called Killed Women Count, and that came directly from her because she just thought that was something that was being completely minimized, and so that is something we were doing. So, you know, we need more female editors, basically. I completely agree with Melissa.
Just go back to Alessia's point about you know, rape is in courts is an adversarial system, and there's a jury, and the problem is that the jury has all the myths that you've all been discussing. So I thought it was very depressing. In January, the Crown Prosecution Service published some research which showed that older people were beginning to see that you could be raped without having bruises all over your body, or you could be raped within marriage. Or you could be raped even though you haven't gone and reported it for several weeks. Younger men, 18 to 24, aren't, you know, half of them don't believe those things. They're still stuck where we all thought we were moving on from. So, but, you know, just to bring a bit more cheerful note into journalism, since the 80s, in the 80s, it was very much alive that women actually said no when they meant yes, or they dressed in a certain way in order to signal that they wanted it, and then decided they didn't, or they'd had bad sex and decided the next day to call it rape. All those things were very current, and you know, judges would talk about contributory negligence because you happened to have had a couple more drinks than you should have, and you were out at 1 o'clock in the morning. So constantly looking at the women's behaviour instead of the men's. I think what's happened since is that we have a whole network of women out there who are on social media, who look at the press and immediately take action when they think a headline is wrong or a picture is wrong, or, you know, and that's a partnership between women out there and the journalists who are trying to do the right thing. Likewise, there are many more women columnists and they will discuss, you know, the fact that Pellico and Al-Fayed has been over and over again. People have been writing their views about it. Actually, it's all contributory to making the atmosphere change. And men, largely men, and it's not always men, but women as well, at senior positions who don't share those views, nevertheless are very aware of the audience out there who are watching how they behave. So I do think there are some reasons for cheerfulness, if you like. I mean, you know, it's not as fast as it should be by any means. When you think Jill Saywood was a woman who was the first to leave her anonymity aside. She'd been raped. It was in the 1980s, I think. Her father was a vicar. Her father, her fiance, and she were in the vicarage one afternoon, and these three men broke in. They beat up the two men. One of them raped Jill Saywood. The men who robbed were given 14 years. The man who raped Jill Saywood was given 5, because the judge thought that the people who'd been the father and fiance had suffered more trauma than Jill Saywood had. I think now the media would be alive with people saying that is not right. Whether it's people writing letters, whether it's columnists, whether it's women journalists actually doing contextual pieces, as Lexi was saying, I think that makes a difference. It's not enough, but it's signs of change.
There's obviously a different way that people consume media now as well. Lots of people consume it digitally, online, through social media. And I think that response to how stories are being covered and that immediacy, being able to, as a member of the public, say that you don't agree with something, that plays a part as well. So I'm going to move to another question. And we talked a bit about good reporting, some of the barriers, but what do we think the impact is, just taking it back to that? How does this fit into what's going on in broader society? What do we think about the impact that the way in which reporting on rape is having? I'm going to go to Melissa first. And I know, Melissa, you've reported a lot on Black and minoritized women's cases, which, as you've already said, we don't see getting as much attention as victims who are white. Do you want to expand a little bit on what the impact actually is for those victims and their stories?
I think that in the media, obviously, when the public views a story, it does two things, because one, it can be a story that people relate to and they feel like, okay, I identify with this person, and even though I didn't go what they went through, like, they're just like me, you know, what happened to them could have happened to me. But when stories about rape happen to women of color and they aren't as widely reported, and when they are reported, perhaps the rape aspect is missed out, I think that it almost feels like women of color are invisible when it comes to this issue. And that's really problematic, because I think that puts people off coming forward about their stories, because they feel like, oh, I'm just going to be the only one talking about it. Is anyone going to believe that this happened to me? Whereas when you see lots of people speaking out who do look like you, I think it empowers you to want to also come out and share your story. I think that nowadays, obviously, yeah, since Me Too, we have seen a lot more reported on rape. But also more recently, we obviously saw the Diddy case that's come out and what happened with him. And I think that when it comes to the way this is reported, I mean, we've seen the phrase freak off parties being used quite a lot. And I think that then sort of normalizes to an extent what was happening, even though it sensationalizes it and it normalizes it, I think, and it makes people think like, okay, but, you know, they were legitimate parties. They were just, you know, freak off parties. Whereas what we know is that allegedly, and sorry, Alessia, but obviously I have to use that word, but allegedly there was a lot more darkness to it. There were things that were going on that were not right. But I think the continuation of using freak off, eventually I think that's already becoming a joke online, to be honest with you. People see that and they think like, you know, it's a joking matter. It's not as serious. It does diminish the seriousness of what is being alleged to have happened. And I think that as reporters, we have to be very mindful of, treading the line between obviously wanting people to pay attention to the story, but also being mindful of, the seriousness and how that affects people who are either involved or people who have also experienced, rape.
Yeah. I know, Alessia, in the resource and in your presentation, you talked a bit about how certain perpetrators are presented as the ideal perpetrator. They sort of fit, and they're at that intersection of sort of racialized stereotypes. I don't know, what do you think about that impact on that kind of reporting has?
Yes, I was talking about the example of like group violence, and when that becomes racialized. I mean, one of the big examples that I found in my study was the Rochdale case, and the victims of what were referred to as gangs. And that had all sorts of consequences for the victims, the reasons why the case didn't come to light when it was first reported, or many years before it then became news, and terrible consequences, obviously, for the victims. I mean, in that case, there was also a problem of class. It was both the fact that the men came from a minority background, but also the girls involved in the case were from a working class background. So that also is another dimension of problematic representation. And obviously there was terrible damage done to victims who did not get justice for years. And it was fundamentally based on the fact that these men were from minority backgrounds. So it is obviously very damaging for victims. Another thing that I was thinking while Melissa was talking, and also going back to some of the things that have been said so far about the damage of reporting that is not really reflected on these problems, is that I think it can entrench those myths even more. So it's not just reporting them, it's not just repeating them, but they can become more entrenched. And one of the things that comes to mind is the use of, like I said in my presentation, of gender neutral language. I think that sometimes I read things like child-on-child violence, when actually we're talking about boys attacking girls. And I think that is very damaging, because, and it links very much to what I said in the presentation about being in a progressive society. I think it's very much the result of the idea, which is very, very, very complex, but it's very much of the idea of equality. Which erases completely the power dynamics in rape cases. So I think that type of language, it can come across as being progressive, but in reality, it can do more damage and revert back to what we were before all the progress that we've made so far. Like Yvonne was saying, about young people not recognizing that something is rape, unlike older people. We need to ask where that is coming from. One of the things I said is also another narrative is the pornification of society. What is the effect that has on violence against women? I think these things are all connected. And I think that a type of reporting that doesn't take this into account can be damaging for victims, but also there is a risk that these myths become more entrenched and we actually go back. We lose all the progress that we have done so far.
I think the other problem is that we're not reporting enough on other forms of rape. So in coercive and controlling behaviour, the person, the man terrifies a woman so much that she will do whatever he says. But that would be so hard to get a conviction with a jury. Really difficult. Or in cases of domestic abuse, where the man the man and the woman have consensual sex, then he rapes her, and then they have consensual sex again. It's again extremely difficult, but there has to be ways around that, because you can have corroborating evidence. You don't just say he said and she said. You have a look around that. But we're not reporting those cases because they're not coming forth. So in a way, I think part of the role of a journalist, and this really depends on having, as Lexi and Melissa were saying, the backup of support from senior people, is to keep pushing the edge to see where are we going with this, with the reporting of rape. How much further can we go? And that really also depends on whether you're working on a certain kind of tab. The Mirror is fine. If you're working on the Daily Mail is still talking about celebrities putting on a busty display. So if you've got that kind of language, which sort of echoes the whole idea of women asking for it and saying no when they mean yes, all of that, it's not a level playing field. Different papers have different cultures.
Yeah, very much so. Alexi, do you want to add anything on this topic of the impact of bad reporting or digital inaccurate reporting?
Only really to reiterate Yvonne's point that we can't only write about the monsters, because that makes women who have been raped by their best friend or the person on the coach of their football club, that they don't actually have anything to complain about. So I think that is really important. I would also just, I'm really keen also on Yvonne's idea of like bringing in the light. The tabloids particularly have made massive strides in this country, I think, on the reporting of not necessarily rape, but violence against women and girls in more general terms. And I think that's genuinely to do with incredible work from people like Eva, who've just kept on at them, and also the work of dedicated female journalists in those newsrooms who really care about it. So I don't think we should discount that. Like, there's a lot of people read The Sun, and you get great articles now where the language is still Sun language, so it still sounds quite sensational. And do you know what? That is very, very going to be very difficult to change that. But alongside it will be, here is what Women's Aid says about trying to stay safe in this kind of situation, or here are the numbers that you can call on if these things have happened to you. So, I just think it's important to realize that you're not just shouting into a void, and that the work that you do and the contact that you have with journalists really does matter, because often journalists are just under so much pressure and time constraints that you want all of these things to be present in their minds at all times, but really it's just about hitting a deadline sometimes. So if you kind of go to a journalist with an open mind and in a kind of spirit of collaboration, then often that can have a really positive impact.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, and I think we have seen a shift and a change in the different types of media outlets that cover our stories and want advice on actually and a steer on how to approach things. I think there are definitely changes that are happening. Before I go to the next question,
I think the other important thing is to work with victim survivors so they understand what the likely long-term impact will be that they are in the media. Because it's one thing being interviewed, it's another thing dealing with what can be horrendous fallout now because of social media, and ensuring that I think, as Melissa was saying, that the words that you use, that you're quoting from them, are actually what they mean to say. I mean, I personally, if I have the time and I'm doing an investigative piece, we'll show the quotes to a victim survivor, because sometimes they say it, but it's not what they meant to say, or it comes out differently. So that sort of gives confidence. And the other thing is anonymity. Less so now, but certainly in the past, a woman who was supposed to be anonymous would be given away because they'd mentioned something about a sister or something that somehow identified them. So I think on many levels, we're much more aware of those, and partly because of organisations like EVOR, like Rape Crisis, like Women's Aid, who are actually, schooling journalists in a way that didn't happen before.
Very much agree. We've had comments coming in, still some more questions actually from the attendees. One comment said, "Thank you, Melissa, for raising this very important point about how sexual violence against women of colour is very often dismissed and minimized. I saw this play out in real time in my newsroom. It's not enough for individuals to raise their voice. We really need to address this in the industry as a whole, because sexual violence against women and girls affects the whole of society in every community and is equally devastating to all." One more question for me, and then I think we'll see about a couple of questions that have been submitted from attendees before we close. And that is that I started off talking very much about the role for accurate and responsible media reporting as part of how we tackle violence against women and girls. I really think the media are so important in this. But how do you all feel that journalists can be part of a wider movement within society to tackle violence against women and girls? Yvonne, what do you think?
I think more and more of us should just name it for what it is, which is the patriarchy. I think we could start changing vocabulary, so we do talk about people are. It's creeping in now. You can write victim survivors, but quite often a sub will turn it back to victims because that's just what they're accustomed to. So I think challenging the language, not just in terms of neutrality, which I agree with you, and I think it's not violence against women and girls; it's male violence against women and girls. So all of the, just trying much harder to push the frontiers, and that will actually depend. I mean, obviously, if you've just joined, just got your first job in journalism, you're not about to, risk losing it. I understand that, but I think also maybe in the training that journalists are given. It's so long since I did it, but I really don't know whether this area is covered, but it certainly should be part of the training of journalists. So that makes a difference.
Yeah, I think definitely it is a different. It can be different for journalists at different stages of their career, I guess, as well. Melissa, do you have any thoughts about the role of journalists and media in tackling violence against women and girls as a whole?
Yeah, I definitely agree that the language does need to change, and it is about male violence against women and girls, because that doesn't, I think we're kind of 100 steps back in that way, because we've not even gotten to the point where stories are incorporating the idea of male violence against women and girls. Everything's being treated as a thing that's happening in isolation. Obviously, if it's an active case, then you can't really add too much. But in cases that are closed, it seems like even upon reflection, even when you're writing about the judgment that's been handed down, it's not incorporating the topic of male violence against women. And yeah, I think that definitely needs to shift. Also, as I raised before, I think that the way that this issue can be championed is if newsrooms do change. And I appreciate the other person's comment, the anonymous person who commented saying, "Thank you for raising the issue about how violence against women of color is dismissed." I think that to put the responsibility on me as an individual to mention to an editor and to shout and to say, this is the issue that I'm having, I don't think it's sustainable, nor is it effective, because essentially you are going to get burnt out from constantly doing that. And I think that as a journalist from a minority background, I think it's good when other journalists, white female journalists, also take a look and say, what, I hear what you're saying. I'm going to bear that in mind when I'm doing a story, or if in our respective newsrooms, to kind of carry that in mind, like, oh, we're reporting on women being raped, but how are we looking at reporting women of color being raped? And just being on alert that this is an issue. And even if it doesn't affect the story that you're doing, just simply being aware that this is an issue that women of color are facing. Because, you know, the reporting barriers on rape are already there, but imagine adding on the additional barrier of race into that, it makes it twice as difficult. And I think that's definitely something that needs to change. So yeah, having a more diverse newsroom and having more women in the newsroom, not just one female editor and that's a wrap, you know, it needs to be a bit more diverse than that, because having one is not going to change everything. It's really not. So yeah, that's how I would say that can definitely help to support organizations like yours and to champion this issue and to push it further.
Thank you, Melissa. Can I come to you, Lexi, and then Alessia, just on this as well? And do you think there's too much emphasis on women having to push these stories?
I feel, I mean, I'm always very practical about these things. Who else is going to do it? We do everything else. So might as well crack on with this as well. I would, on the campaigning front, I would say two things. I think it's really important for news journalists like me to not be campaigners. Mm-hmm. That's not our job. We are journalists. But what is also our job is to take a step back and look at the news with like the cold hard stare of news, you know, look at it and go, this is a genuine epidemic that is happening in our country. And just because it keeps on happening doesn't mean it's not a news story. So how can I make this an engaging news story? And that is my job, not to campaign, but to do the news. And this is news. Like, that's really important to me. I think campaigners can help journalists by recognizing that we often aren't trained on this stuff. Like all of the training that I've had on speaking to victims, trauma-informed reporting, making sure that people have informed consent is entirely self-taught. I've never been taught anything like that. So bear that in mind when you're dealing with journalists. Sometimes they actually might just need a bit of help because they've had no training on this. And on the larger conceptualization piece, I think it's really important that when we're talking about individual stories, we can put in facts about the landscape of rape in this country. And the easiest way for us to do that is for you to pick up the phone straight away when we call you, for the comment to come within an hour of us asking, and for that comment to come with links to research that states the facts. They are three really easy things. I mean, they're not actually that easy, but they are three possible things that campaigners can do that will help inform better reporting. And journalists, I think, often given, you know, those stark facts in a timely manner, will actually take them up because they're just grateful for not having to find it themselves and for someone saving them that time.
I think exactly what Lexi's saying. I think the other link is between journalists and academia. I mean, when we were doing a series on femicide, I just found an enormous amount of work had been done by academics, mostly female, but they'd done the work, they published the work, and then nothing had happened. I mean, you know, and it was revelatory about certain aspects of men killing women, including men raping women, but which could have informed policy, and it could have informed budgets, you know, and it could have informed the amount of support that organizations like EVOR get. But there's no clearinghouse that says that what the journalists, as far as I know, that journalists can access easily, quickly, as Lexi's saying, because, you know, if you've got 3 hours to write something, that's very different from having the luxury of spending several weeks, you know, looking at an issue in the whole. So I think in many ways there are missed opportunities for dispersing this huge amount of knowledge now, that because women have been so active in this field, we just need to be able to access it more easily.
What do you think, Alessia? Because that actually leads into what you've been doing as an academic researcher.
Yes, I completely agree with Yvonne. There is a lot of research in this area because it's my area of research. I'm aware of a lot of research, but I also know a lot of colleagues who don't necessarily engage with this. And there are a number of barriers, you know, in academia itself. It's another another very complex institution. So it is true there should be more collaboration, and this was the aim of the event we're having today. And it's always been a driving force in my research, but it's not the case for everybody. It can be for reasons like not knowing that that's a possibility, or there might be so many reasons, but definitely that's something that I think would benefit both, because I benefit from engaging with the people that I'm talking about, that I'm writing about, and I think they can also benefit from the findings of my research. In terms of what I think that the media, and particularly journalism, can do, I think an important aspect is to keep talking about the problem. It goes back to what Alexia was saying, is the difficulty of taking these ordinary stories and turning them into news stories. But I think it's very important to keep talking about it, because there is so much amnesia about women's history, about their achievements, about the things that the discrimination that they experience. There's the rise of what is called neo-sexism. So the idea that women now have achieved equality, now the men are the victims. And so I think there's a need to constantly reiterate the fact that this is a residual problem of our society. It's not gone away, even if it feels like we are reinventing the wheel all the time. I think Yvonne said this earlier. And I think, yes, the media are a powerful social institution, but again, like you were saying, we're not activists, especially news journalists. But I think there is, and it's a difficult balance. It'd be interesting to talk about this, but how do we find the balance between not turning journalists into activists, but also acknowledging that they have the power to be a force for social change by talking about these problems, changing the language, but also talking about the issues in the broader system. We talked about problems in the law, how this affects journalism. So I think these are things that the media can talk about. And also, a final point is my research was about dominant patterns. So I completely agree, there are many examples of good practice. My study was about looking at the majority. What is the majority of news doing? But there are many examples of good practice. And I actually think that's very important to remind ourselves of this. Like I said at the end of my presentation, if one journalist changes the way they write, they will disrupt the dominant narrative. So I think that's something that's really, again, a point worth reiterating.
Can I just make a very tiny point? It's just a small plea to any academics who are watching this, is don't rely on your press office to pull your research into the public domain, because in the main, they are totally useless. Like, if you care about a subject and you know that you're going to be working on it for years and years, then forge relationships, personal relationships with journalists who also care about those subjects. And they're not that difficult to tell. I mean, anyone could tell that I write about this stuff, or Yvonne or Melissa, we do this type of work all the time, and we will never be upset if we have got a personal approach from an academic saying, listen, it's not ready yet, but can I talk to you about this really exciting research I'm doing? It's coming a couple of months down the line. And that is honestly so welcome.
Could I just say something?
Oh, yes. I was going to try and squeeze in one more question, sort of reflection from the Q&A before we close, because I thought it was quite interesting. And that's really around how we can encourage sort of new generations of journalists, given Yvonne mentioned earlier, regression in attitudes that's happening, and a reliance perhaps on more clickbait type headlines to try and compete in an online environment, and with everyone's reduced concentration spans, but also operating in a context of scarcity and a time when we're all sort of overloaded with information. Like, how do we interpret this issue when it comes to the online context? Just if anyone has some thoughts on that they'd like to share before we close.
I think this is a bigger. It's beyond the media. It's a cultural thing. I mean, we've got to stop having naked women constantly being raped for 3 hours on television, on digital television, on Netflix, on whatever. You know, the culture is we still live in a very rapey culture, if you like, and it's sort of like as has been said, it does normalize it. But I do think I mean I'm, you know, maybe foolishly, but I actually do have hope that there is I think we're in a very precarious position currently where things could change substantially or they could go back further. And I think there's an opportunity there, but it needs an awful lot of sort of small tributaries to come together to make sure that you know, I'm getting a bit carried away here, but you know, the river is as strong as it possibly can be. So these major cases with Al Fayed, with Pellico, with the Tate brothers, I mean, you know, there has to be an awareness now in society that this kind of toxic masculinity has to be properly addressed, which is why the Labour government has said it's going to halve violence against women, male violence against women and girls in a decade. I mean, we have to, journalists, campaigners, organisations, individual women, we have to hold them to account to do that. And as Lexi said, it always falls down to the women to do it. So I think that's our task, really.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to wrap up soon, but just quickly, we're going to go around to everybody. One final reflection, Melissa?
I was going to say that I think that the more stories, because I think, Yvonne, at the beginning, you laid out all the stats about how many women are reporting rape and what the outcomes are. And the stats are horrifying. So many women, even stories that I've done that are not about women being raped, when I'm interviewing a person, they end up telling me, you know, I've been raped, and that happens so often. So we're not seeing a lot of these stories actually make it to the paper or online or wherever. And I think that would make the difference, that more of these stories do get written, because I think that the more that they are, then people really do start to pay attention. And it's like the project that the Guardian did, where you reported on women who were killed. You know, I think that that's really good because it's showing how serious the issue is. So maybe like moving forward, I don't know. I think it just needs to be reported on more. And I think we actively need to do more to bring those stories out, whether it's like, you know, doing a call out to say, or to organizations like yours, or to other organizations, just reaching out and saying, do you have people who really want to share their stories? Let's do it, you know?
Thank you. Alexi, 30 seconds.
I only want to say that the work that is being done in this area is really urgent and important, but I'm really heartened by the skills and perseverance and resilience of everyone involved in this sector, because it's hard work and it has an impact on your mental health as well as, you know, the people around you. So it's a real just a thank you to anybody, to you and to everyone on this call for doing this work. And in a hope that, you know, journalists can work together with campaigners to make sure that we actually do try and shift the dial.
Finally, Alessia?
Yes, I'm only going to add what Lexi was saying and say that I think a good reporting is possible. There is plenty of good reporting out there, and for it to get better, it needs surface level language changes and needs to promote a deeper shift in narrative structures if journalism is to have a positive impact and on social attitudes and behaviours, and in the fight against the cultural beliefs and inequalities that underpin violence against women.
Thank you so much. That brings us to an end of really, really interesting discussion. Really appreciate all our panelists, and thank you to Alessia as well for providing the insight and presentation on her fascinating research. And we really hope that the resource that we've published will be useful and provide opportunities for reflection on language and the choices that better represent the realities of rape. I just have one final ask for any of the attendees we'd be really grateful if you could complete a short anonymous feedback survey, which we're going to email around shortly after this event. And we'll also be sharing the recording of this event early next week as well. So do pass that on to your colleagues who were unable to join us today. And do stay in touch with us as we develop this work, and follow us on our social media platforms at EBAW UK, or also on TikTok at EBAW Coalition. It's been a pleasure, and thank you everybody for joining us.